All right. Hey, everyone. Adam Berezin here from MSDW. I'd like to welcome you all for today's session on using Microsoft Dynamics 365 to simplify manufacturing and warehousing. We're joined today by Jim Dart from enVista. If you have any questions during the session, please type them into the chat box, and Jim will get back to you after the session ends. Jim, without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Adam. Good day, everyone. My name is Jim Dart with enVista. I'm a vice president in our technology group, our Microsoft Services ERP. I've been in software and consulting for about 25 years now, and I've started in the D365 in the AX channel back almost 20 years now, back in 2005. Thanks for sharing a little bit of your day. We're going to focus today on D365 and ERP implementations, and in particular, a couple areas that we often find are very challenging from an implementation perspective and can often get away from being simple. So we want to offer a few ways, share a few ways that we found over the years to help keep these simple and help keep your implementations on time, on target. Technical difficulties there. I thought I knew how to move the slides forward. So from an agenda perspective, I think we got it going now. So just one slide about enVista, and then we focus on the content around manufacturing and warehouse, and that will be the agenda for today. Moving along quickly, enVista is to use the term end-to-end supply chain consulting organization. So from a Microsoft channel perspective, somewhat unique in my experience, in my 20 plus or so years in the channel, where it is not just a technology organization. We can do everything from a supply chain and business perspective, from helping you design warehouses and design network supply chains through kind of all the way through the life cycle of that project. We've been a Microsoft practice since 2008, implementing AX, Exapta, and D365 finance and supply chain operations. And we have about 320 plus associates, almost exclusively here in the US. We do have an India-based organization, but strategy you see there, kind of in small letters there, strategy, systems, technology, automation, and support. From a Microsoft perspective, we can address everything from M365 and security, kind of all the way through the business application stack, including CE and Fabric and Power BI. So just a brief introduction there on enVista, and so now we're into the content of the presentation, keeping things simple. I think one of the having been in done software and implementations for over 25 years now, I think this is one of the most important areas to keep in mind as you go through a project. There are a number of ways that can trip up an implementation, a project, change management being one of them. But if we talk from a software or systems perspective, I think one of the areas that we see most often that can lead to problems is trying to build too complex of a solution. And that the note there at the top, I think it's important to keep in mind that when we do this implementation, we're not trying to model everything in the environment. We're not trying to model the reality. We're just seeking to provide an environment where you get process and transaction efficiency. And so that means we don't have to have everything in the ERP system, kind of leading down there into the second bullet. As much as when the ERP world started kind of in the 90s, and those of us who have been ERP folks for 20 or 25 years might might like to say that everything has to be in the ERP. I think the reality that we're finding now, a couple decades on into these types of software systems, is that it's important to use the right tool for the right job. Another area that we find that often can increases the complexity and prevents you from keeping things simple is that a lot of times when we talk with folks during discovery sessions, they talk a lot about the time that they spend managing exception processes and go into this type of process with the mindset of needing to automate those because those are the things that take their time. On the other hand, we recommend, in the interest of keeping it simple, to avoid automating the exception processes. There are activities and processes within your business that you just need and want to have human individuals managing on a day in and day out basis. So we seek to automate the processes that are repetitive and high volume, and not necessarily seek to automate the exception processes that occur in one business. Another area that we see can lead to complexity, even though in some areas it might be simpler for one stakeholder versus another, is occasion we find that making it easy, or often we find that making it easy in one area makes it difficult in another. One example that I've come across in my career is where we build the finance system or design the finance system in a very detailed way. So the business reporting is really easy for the finance team to kind of pull that out for financial or operational reporting. But sometimes that can lead to a significant increase in the transaction requirements in the operational areas. And so you certainly have to balance that. Obviously, a major reason for implementing a system such as this is to improve the reporting and improve the visibility. But we have to think about what happens in one area, because these systems are so interconnected, the impact that it has on another area of the business. And lastly, sometimes it doesn't necessarily mean that simpler means faster. It probably means faster from an implementation perspective, but from a design perspective, it often takes a little more thought to make it simple and preparation, and not necessarily less. So a couple of topics there to think about in terms of overall from the implementation and how to keep things simple from the start. So we picked manufacturing and warehousing as the focus areas for this presentation, because we often find that these are the areas that can lead to the most complexity. And if we find that if you can keep these areas simple, then much of the rest of the implementation can be simple as well, and streamlined and finish on time and on budget. So the next few slides here will discuss about opportunities to keep your manufacturing implementation simple and ways that you can use D365 to accomplish that. There are a number of kind of overall topics to think about from manufacturing: materials management, labor and machine time, master planning, material requirements planning. We're going to start from a materials perspective and how we can use D365 to keep the implementation simple in a materials management and manufacturing area. So one idea there is to expense consumables. Don't put those on the bill of materials or the formula. A lot of manufacturing organizations, they've got these giant bins or drums of rivets or screws, or maybe there's in a process manufacturing organization, there's a giant tank out back with some material that's used in large quantities in every product. We don't necessarily need to have those on the BOM. Some of those things can be just expensed as you're bought, because they're not really tracked, and they're not expensive. I mean, that's a big part of it too, is it's not a huge expense in terms of relative to the cost of the product overall. So one idea, expense the consumables. Another idea for keeping things simple is to backflush the BOM items on the BOMs lines. And so again, this one typically you're not doing this for the items that are low volume and high dollar values, but these are items that are used in significant quantities and usually just used in the standard quantities that are consumed to manufacture the finished good. But backflushing BOM lines to the maximum extent possible can obviously keep that manufacturing environment simple. Ignoring scrap and yield, again, depends on how important this is in your environment, but it can increase the maintenance of the requirements around the bill of materials and the complexity of the picking and reporting. So ignoring the scrap and yield is a third idea there. Interaction with the route operation. In D365, there's the potential to associate specific materials in the BOM or the formula with a particular route operation. But again, from a setup perspective, unless it's key items that are, really important to introduce at one point in the operation versus another, that's a detail from a setup and a data maintenance perspective that often doesn't, necessarily add a ton of value from the manufacturing perspective. Formulas and percentages for formulas is another area that can simplify the maintenance, that can simplify the setup and maintenance of your bill of material or your formula. Formula, more particularly when you talk about process manufacturing organizations, the way that you set this up in D365 is to 50% this and 10% that and 10% another, and then based on the quantity on the formula from the production order, then the system just calculates how much is going to be needed to produce. And lastly, in terms of materials, is the use of phantoms. How folks out there are familiar with what a phantom is, but it is often in the manufacturing of a product, there are kind of other subassemblies that may be needed to be produced, but only at the time that the item or the main subassembly is being produced. If you use phantom, it simplifies the bill of material because you don't have to have an extra level in the bill of material, and the shop floor is just guided to create this particular subassembly at the time it's needed to go into the main subassembly, and you're not tracking the inventory of that, which would be the case if it was a separate level in a multi-level bill of materials. So the use of phantoms is another way to keep a manufacturing implementation simple. The next topic to talk about is labor and machine. And this is an area that while including labor and machine in your manufacturing implementation allows to capture the costs of labor and the machine costs, oftentimes we find that manufacturing organizations just don't have the data to support this. And I would go so far as to say that if I think back on all the manufacturing implementations that I've done with customers over the time, I would say that as many as 3 and 5 are utilizing bill of materials or formulas only in their manufacturing operations. One of the main reasons for this is that those organizations feel like the costs of the machine and the labor are so small relative to the cost of the materials in the product that they haven't found value in including that in the tracking. So not using routings or using simple single step routings can be a very effective tool in simplifying a manufacturing simplifying a manufacturing implementation. When we start talking about routings, this is a particular point that I would tie back to that first slide that discussed that we're not necessarily modeling reality. If you are going to use routings and a simple single step routing can be effective. You might have a manufacturing operation with 4 or 5 steps. You don't necessarily need to have routing steps for each of those if there's not any real break that in the process where you need to capture inventory or that the time is separated. So this is a particular example of not having to model everything in the business environment. Moving from labor and machine to time entry. Time entry is another key topic typically in terms of manufacturing implementations with D365. Usually when we do a manufacturing implementation, we talk about kind of 3 different ways to manage the time entry. And in this slide, this is going from the simplest to the most complex, but even within these, there are ways to simplify the manufacturing implementation to achieve the desired goals. The first level at the top there is effectively no time entry. That doesn't mean that we're in this case that we're not implementing routes and not capturing labor and machine time, but the idea is that we're simply backflushing that, and so we're capturing that based on the standard that's defined for the quantity of the product that's being produced. But again, this minimizes the transaction volume. It's just something that is done either at the beginning or the end of the production order process, and allows rolling up the standard amount of time into the cost of the product. That is actually a fairly common approach, probably among the 3. One of the most common approaches that we see is to, particularly from a starting standpoint from an implementation. The second level example there is to use D365 timesheets, or these are the route cards recording time for the route cards in the D365 manufacturing implementation. But in here, here it would just be recording the actual time consumed. So, some increase in the transaction volume and transaction discipline required relative to backflushing, but it is a very simple single entry that captures the actual time recorded. So it's a small improvement from the backflush, because in a backflush scenario, you just have the standard time that's recorded. If if a shop floor employee is recording time for the work center, then you are actually capturing the actual time. So if it takes longer than a standard for some reason to finish a particular production order, that extra actual expense is captured into that particular production run. And then lastly, D365 does have a manufacturing execution system that allows for the clock on and clock off of jobs. And so this, again, one way to simplify that is by having just a single person record the time for an entire team. So if you have a particular manufacturing line that requires 3 or 4 or 5 folks to work on the line, to run it through a production order from beginning to end, then just have the team lead, clock on and clock off of those jobs for everyone across the production order. A couple ideas there for simplifying the time entry element of manufacturing implementation. The next topic is one that is somewhat near and dear to my heart, because in my experience, it is the costing area that is the most guilty area of increasing complexity in a manufacturing implementation and causing organizations challenges down the road. I have an example of this from previous experience going back a number of years. I was working with a steel company in Houston. The partner that I was working with at the time had been asked to come in and help them figure out what was going on with their costing. And if I if I think back on my career, the times that have been the most challenging to go in and help a company figure out what was going on with their implementation, it was the costing area that always seemed to give folks the most trouble and they had the most questions about. But this particular client, when they did their implementation, they allowed someone who was supposedly this genius finance consultant and developer sit in a corner and modify everything about the costing methodology. It was actually an AX 2012 deployment. And now here we were a year5 we were back in there. We were, not the partner that implemented. I was there with a team of about 5 people, remember exactly for sure. And they were paying us almost $1 million to figure out what had been done with our costing environment, because it was so complex and so convoluted that they couldn't understand it, even months after the implementation. So, lesson learned, do all that you can to capture the information that you need for costing purposes, but don't make it so complex that it's so hard to understand. A couple ideas here for how to keep it simple. Routings are ways to, or the lack of a use of routings or what is one way to keep it simple. It minimizes your ability to capture labor and machine costs, but again, the materials are all there. Avoid item overhead accounting. This one is fairly interesting to me, having been now in the industry 25 years or so. There was this accounting theory that was popular, if I think back to the 90s and the early 2000s, called activity-based costing. You set up a bunch of cost driver. It's going to perfectly model all the costs that go into an item. And we try to recommend avoiding that at this point, although it has been a number of years since I remember someone bringing up that. I can remember, if we go back 10 or more years, having conversations about activity-based costing and detailed item overhead accounting, but it seems to have lost its steam from a business process perspective. And so that is one way that we would encourage folks to keep manufacturing costing simple. In D365 supply chain management, there's a costing sheet that allows for defining overheads using surcharges and rates and cost bases. But again, this is kind of in line with the second bullet up there. We find it very useful to keep this simple because it can get complex very quickly. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving along here. I want to talk about supply planning or master planning, material requirements planning. And the first bullet there is a key one. Embrace action and futures messages. So those of you that have run material requirements planning in your careers are familiar with action and futures messages. These can get complicated not complicated. These can become, I think, overwhelming if not implemented correctly. And so, but used correctly, they can be very useful to the planners in determining, what to do with the planned and actual orders that are out there in terms of, maintaining consistency in the supply chain. So embrace the action in the future messages. I think the message there would be start simple and build into it. Start with one or two items that are key and that you need to manage. Figure out how the action and future messages work, and then expand it out into the other items. Use ABC analysis. So the old 80-20 rule. Focus on the items that drive the most of your volume and or profit. I always like to include profit there, not just volume, because sometimes organizations focus so much on the quantity that there may be other items that really drive a much higher level of profit. Carry extra inventory for those items that don't drive the profitability of the volume. For this one, I have an example from my past that I like to think about and talk about here. Was working with a food manufacturing company that made sliced luncheon meats for major sandwich chains, and so a lot of the effort was obviously focused on making sure that the product supply was available for those lines because everything was such high volume. But there was this small line off to the side that did vacuum packed sliced luncheon meats for grocery stores. And as you can imagine, the margin for these vacuum packed sliced luncheon meats was 8x higher than for the sliced luncheon meats for the sandwich chains. And so you don't necessarily want to starve the high profit lines to feed those high volume, lower profit lines. So you have to keep in not just volume, but also profitability when you think about ABC analysis. Plan at a site level can simplify the supply planning or the material requirements planning process. So a lot of times organizations, large facilities or campuses, and maybe you have multiple buildings, or it's a large building and you have physical or logical separations of the warehouses within that. But so it can simplify the master planning process by planning overall at a site level rather than by individual warehouse. The third point there, the safety stock journal. This is one of the most underrated, I think, tools that is available in the D365, manufacturing and material requirements planning area. This safety stock journal, and so I always kind of get a kick out of when I go into organizations and learn how they're using this, because too many people aren't. The safety stock journal actually looks at existing transactions for an item and can do the calculation to recommend how much safety stock to keep of a particular item, and then of course just automatically post that into the system. And so an underrated tool that in D365 supply chain management that can simplify a manufacturing implementation. And lastly, I want to mention MRP and DDMRP. So MRP is master planning, as it's more specifically called in D365 supply chain management. Or in the last couple of years, Microsoft has implemented demand-driven material requirements planning, which is a process that is been developed in the past couple of years in the supply chain that allows kind of decoupling of the supply chain to be able to manage inventory at intermediate points in the process. And so I think the point about keeping it simple here is making sure that you're choosing the right one of these for the type of supply chain that your organization have. I mean, I think MRP or master planning, we typically think of being in a push supply chain where you're producing to forecast and moving the products out into the supply chain to meet demand. Whereas, as the words say, demand-driven material requirements planning would be more in an environment where you are trying to pull products through the supply chain based on customer demand. Capacity planning. The next couple of slides I'm going to go through rather quickly so we can get to the warehousing area. But capacity planning is an area where ERP systems have evolved over the years. In the say late 90s, early 2000s, one of the critiques of ERP planning was that they weren't capacity based. And so over the years, when I first started on Exapta 3.0, it was an infinite based, capacity plan in the material, in the master planning, in the MRP area. And so some of those capabilities have been added. It can, again, increase the complexity. I think the point there, only use a finite capacity if you have to. Most folks kind of anecdotally or through, organizational knowledge and experience have a pretty good idea of, what can run through their operations in a particular day or week or month. And so, putting that capabilities into the system can lead to challenges and increase the complexity of an implementation. So, D365 supply chain management can include capacity planning, but think hard about that before you implement it, or implement it and as it is without the capacity planning initially, and work that in on little by little. Scheduling. There are actually two types of scheduling available within D365 supply chain management. One is referred to as operations scheduling. Operations scheduling effectively schedules by day and by production order, whereas job scheduling schedules all the individual jobs on a particular production order or batch order. And so often we find at an ERP level that operations scheduling is sufficient. Once you get down into scheduling, every job on every work order, it just starts to become it's a bigger challenge. And so if you can get away with operations scheduling, the simplest approach is to utilize that. Leave sequencing to shop leads. So D365 capability, that's one of the areas in the past probably 6 or 8 years that D365 master planning has added the capability to add characteristics to products and sequence based on characteristics. But again, that can often be accomplished as easily by the shop leads. So that would be an area that we would recommend taking a hard look at and keeping simple from a system perspective, to leave the production sequencing to shop leads. And similar to our point about finite capacity, there is capability to do finite scheduling, but again, either start simple or as a phase 2, and keep at least initially, the manufacturing implementation simple. moving along, just going to talk high level about this slide. This slide going from top to bottom there, from kind of high volume, lower dollar products down to engineer to order, which is low volume, very, very high dollar products. I think the point about scheduling and the point about implementation here is to make sure you're choosing the right software tools or capabilities that meets your this type of manufacturing. You can't forecast and use safety stock for an engineer to order business. You need to use projects and track everything for the customer of that business. And so, starting at the top there, kind of looking down, not going to really read through all of that, but that's the important part of scheduling, is making sure that you're using the right functionality for the right manufacturing process. So those are a number of our ideas for keeping manufacturing simple in a D365 implementation, from materials to costing to master planning. The next subject up for us is warehousing. Warehousing is another area where, to use a phrase, the rubber meets the road in a manufacturing organization. Sometimes in other areas, such as maybe finance or procurement, there are tasks or activities that can be done as workarounds to accomplish the goals of the organization. But within the manufacturing environment and within the warehousing environment, things just have to happen, and maybe more so than anything, they have to happen in a timely manner. We can't have trucks stacking up outside waiting to get delivered, waiting to get loaded to go deliver the items. So a few ideas here about how to keep a warehousing implementation simple. Couple comments from an overall setup perspective, and I think overall meaning, I think these apply not only to kind of internal operations, but maybe even more importantly, kind of inbound operations as well as outbound operations within a warehouse. So directed actions require more setup. Modern day warehouse management systems have been designed and built with capabilities to provide directed actions for users and the mobile devices. The downside of that is needing to, one, define all the rules from a business perspective, and two, set those all up in the system. And so I think that's something that in a lot of cases we found that the organizational knowledge can be good enough, or at least can be good enough in many situations. So that is something to think about when going through a D365 warehouse management implementations, is how detailed do you need to get from a directed actions perspective. And then the second one there, more validation requires more setup. That's really not just unique to a warehouse management implementation, but across the spectrum. Label generation is an important part. Setting up the different data that goes on a label, setting up the different conversion factors that need to be used in the picking and label generation. Check digits are functionalities that can increase transaction integrity, but again, it requires more setup and it requires a greater level of transaction discipline in the organization, and you just have to find the right balance. So keeping warehouse simple. This is in discussion with regard to outbound operations. So whether that's shipping or shipping finished goods orders, trucks or transfers that might need to go out to other organizational units. The first bullet there, configure user-directed menu items. This is referring to what you're putting on the mobile device for the users. And so, in a lot of areas, configuring more means making it more complex. In this particular example, configuring more really means driving the simplicity to the user. So, we recommend doing everything that you can to present the user with as minimal information as possible to do what they need to do for their specific activities. So, this is one area where we usually say more configuration makes it worse. This is an area where we feel like more configuration makes it better for the end users. Use pre-printed license plates. Pretty much every warehouse you go into today, you walk in there and by the office, there's this label printer that has rolls of barcoded, license plates that when you're receiving or taking from production and putting away, that you can go slap one of those on the pallet and use that in the transport process. Another way to keep it simple is to release and process single orders at a time. I think, this is an area that would come in the category of, recommend to the maximum extent possible. No, that's not going to be possible for every type of product. And that's, obviously one of the values of a warehouse management system is to be able to do wave picking for multiple orders at a time. But, that can lead to complexities and challenges at an end user's perspective. So, to the maximum extent possible, processing an order at a time is a simpler approach from an outbound warehousing perspective. From an inbound perspective, a couple ideas to reduce the complexity and keep the implementation simple is to avoid mixed license plates. So create the process so that to the maximum extent possible, it's one item on one pallet and not a whole bunch of items on one pallet. Going back to our first slide, minimal directed put away setup. So when the material comes in, let the user determine where to put the items. Use that, leverage that organizational knowledge that is there. Again, use the pre-printed license plate. Same comment as in the previous slide. And then fixed locations is a feature in D365 that can be used for fast moving parts or fast moving, raw materials. The system just knows for that item where it goes all the time. No one has to think about it. And the system doesn't have to try and choose. So a couple ideas there for maintaining inbound simplicity in the inbound design processes for warehouse management. Inventory setup, so just kind of internal warehouse operations, periodic cycle counts. Programs use the spot count by aisle to check inventory is an effective way to ensure inventory accuracy and is simple from a system perspective relative to detailed counting programs. Manual replenishment. So, thinking about replenishment from inventory locations to forward pick areas, that's not even throughout the day in most cases. And so don't try to tell the system or have folks be reliant on the system or to go back to the system to calculate and when to replenish and forward pick areas. have that communication between team members based on visuals in the warehouse. I like this third one, particularly when you start talking about inventory statuses and quality management, because setting up the extended quality management capabilities, there's a couple different features. There's quarantine orders and there's quality orders, and each of them are a little bit different within the D365 supply chain inventory management. But a simple way to actually accomplish this within D365 without setting up that quality management detail is to leverage inventory statuses and adjustment reason codes. So, change the inventory status means can prevent it from being picked for sales orders or production orders, and the adjustment codes can be used to identify the reasons why particular material is not available. So that can be a powerful alternative to really detailed quality management setups. And I think we're down to the last slide here in terms of keeping warehousing and manufacturing simple in the production area. For warehouse, one idea is to just simply use a single default input location to the manufacturing areas, regardless of the line, so that just kind of simplifies the transaction discipline and allows it to move, more quickly from, storage areas into production. Similar to the idea from the outbound processes, order picking items or picking, for a particular line, as opposed to across lines, defining processes to work in that way from a system level can simplify those processes. This third bullet there, set the BOM lines to available at location, is a flushing principle in the warehouse management system that allows materials that have been moved into the production area to automatically be consumed. So thereby, reducing an additional transaction that might have previously been need to be made, but that is a setting within warehousing that can simplify the transaction processing in the production area. And lastly, again, tying back to that theme of organizational knowledge and put away rules, materials or goods that are coming off the production line, going back into the warehouse to be later picked and shipped. Just simple put away rules there. Allow the users and the organizational knowledge to drive that, can simplify a warehousing implementation. So thank you for your time today. Those are a few ideas from the enVista team about D365 finance and supply chain implementations and how to simplify the couple key areas that often result in complexities and challenges from a system perspective within your implementations in the manufacturing and warehousing areas. Thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks, everybody.